İyi akşamlar. Thank you for joining us for this talk tonight, and we're thrilled to see so many of you here. And I'm sorry that you don't have seats. You should all be as comfortable as everyone out there, but I hope you enjoy tonight. I'm delighted to be representing the Royal Institute of British Architects in Istanbul to launch our first talk here as part of the exciting RIBA VitrA talk series. We are honoured to have the internationally renowned architect Daniel Libeskind join us this evening. Sorry, this is the clicker. Oh. Sarah.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. The RIBA is a global professional membership body driving excellence in architecture. We serve our members and society in order to deliver better buildings and places, stronger communities, and a sustainable environment. The RIBA has a focus on international regions where we build on local expertise through sharing knowledge and influencing the framework in which architecture can flourish internationally. Please do go to our website, architecture.com, to find out more information on how to become a member. Being inclusive, ethical, environmentally aware, collaborative underpins all that we do. It is with these values in mind that we have partnered with VitrA Bathrooms. On behalf of the RIBA, I would like to extend our huge thanks to VitrA Bathrooms for sponsoring this exciting series, showcasing the best in contemporary, established, and emerging voices in architecture. Leading architects are speaking in events which will take place in London, across the UK, and here in Istanbul. In London, we have had inspiring talks from Sir David Adjaye, Sana, Assemble, Frida Escobedo, Mass Design Group, and Turkey's very own Emre Aralat, and many more. Over half of the talks have been to sell-out audiences, and we have had the most wonderful positive feedback from all of our attendees. We now look forward to continuing this success in Istanbul, so please do let us know your feedback following this evening. We are thrilled to be joined by Daniel Libeskind this evening, a hugely important Polish-American architect who has created some of the most distinctive buildings around the world. Daniel, along with his wife Nina, who we are delighted is also here with us this evening, together founded the studio in Berlin in 1989 and are now firmly established in New York City. Daniel is known globally for groundbreaking projects such as the Jewish Museum in Berlin, the Imperial War Museum North, the World Trade Center Master Plan, and many more cultural projects, universities, commercial centers, and residential work around the world. Born in Lutz, Poland in 1946, Daniel was a virtuoso musician before studying architecture and has taught and lectured at universities all around the globe and has, of course, won numerous awards. After the talk, we'll have an opportunity for a few questions from the audience, so please do keep that in mind for the duration of the talk. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Daniel Libeskind to the stage.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Wow. Now you know why I work with my wife Nina, because it was her idea to get everybody onto the stage. She's a... So I would like to share with you just a few things and some thoughts about architecture. I recently published a book with this title, Edge of Order. And I begin this book with a quote of a great French philosopher and poet, Paul Valéry, who says that two dangers constantly threaten the world, order and disorder. Of course, we are threatened by order, by people who give us orders and put society into order. They are a threat. But so are, of course, the chaotic and disordered events that we witness. So really my idea is very much to navigate between these two extreme poles, not the order that has been ordered, nor the disorder that is chaotic. In between, that's the adventure, really, of architecture as I see it. And it's about the culture of architecture, because architecture is not just making buildings, but it is a communication to the great public about what is the meaning of what we build. Now, how did I start? I was a professional musician. I didn't work for any architect, actually. I tried for 1 or 2 days to work for some famous architects, but I thought it was a little boring. I was young, so I was kind of crazy. I thought there was another way to do architecture, and it was really through my love of mathematics, geometry, and drawing. And that's how I started. Really, for many years, I did not have any commissions. I had no clients, so I did not draw fantasy projects. I drew really abstract drawings, but drawings which are architecture, drawings which are projections of order into disorder and structures which really were in my mind in terms of what connects architecture really across the globe. Later on, I created a series of drawings called chamberworks, which were related very much to music. Because architecture is like music. It's written like a symphony orchestra or an oratorio. It is also something which is then projected to other people by other interpreters. And that is really the sense of creating this group of drawings, which is a kind of a treatise on architecture in terms of how to create a city, how to create a building. It might look crazy. And actually, when I drew these drawings, I had not a single building. I remember when I was lecturing in, I think in Berkeley many, many years ago, somebody after my lecture said to me, "Mr. Libeskind, do you take drugs or LSD?" No, it was architecture is the drug. Architecture is the passion in whose intensity. All those lines really have a future. Nothing that is drawn is just in the past. Everything drawn is a projection into the future. And so my very first project I called Voices. It's a project for a museum, the Jewish Museum in Berlin. And as you know, through the Holocaust eliminated, it was a genocide, 6 million Jews, but as also 50 million other people perished as a result of this fatal mark on the world. And I started by studying the names of Berliners, starting with the name Berlin. Well, I cannot say that I studied hundreds, thousands of names, but I plotted these names into a kind of imaginative new constellation of the city, which really connected Germans, Jews across the void, across the absence. And of course, the museum deals with the fact that even though we have a present, the present also has absence. In this present, there's something which is fundamentally missing, a dimension of humanity. And so I created a museum that has a very unorthodox structure. You enter into the underground. You're not connected really through the new building at all. It has no door in a way. The door is deep in the underground, which is an oblique plane. And at the end of it is a kind of a dead end. I called it a Holocaust Tower. And I have to tell you that when I worked on this, I thought for many years there was no light. It was a closed volume because I thought these events have no light. There is no light when you exterminate people. It's just darkness. But then I read an account of a survivor later on, many years later in Brooklyn, who said, when I was locked into those cars and deported into death, I saw a crack of light. And she said, I don't know what it was, whether it was just a crack in the car, in the wood of the car, or whether I was peering through and seeing the smoke of an airplane. But whatever it was, I held onto the light. And that is how I survived. And then at the last moment, I did put really this very sharp edge of light at the top of this really tower, which, by the way, cannot display any art. It's not heated in the winter. It's not cooled in the summer. It's a space of an encounter with the echoes of the past. There you see it. It's an echoing chamber. It's a place also that has a garden. It's an unusual garden because Berlin is not only the dead end of a city, but also an exile of the city. So much of Berlin is outside, somewhere else. It's a very symbolic garden. It has 7 times 7, 49 columns, which stand on an oblique plane. Symbolic because the earth is deeply buried in these columns. And 48 of them really have the earth of Berlin. The 49th one in the center has the earth of Jerusalem. And it's, of course, the date, 1948, foundation of the State of Israel. The main stair, as you see, doesn't go into an atrium. It doesn't have a door at the end. It's just a way through the light of hope to understand that there is no redemptive idea. There is no atrium. There is no sort of getting together. It's just a penetration through the end into a world that is both irretrievable, cannot be changed, but also a world of hope into the future generations, how we take these events, how we understand these events. And of course, the windows are not really regular windows either. They are that map. If you think of the Berlin map of those addresses, which I started with, and fold it into the building, there are more than 1,000 windows. Each one is different. Each one has a different angle, looking obliquely through the city and connecting you to places which no longer exist where people lived. They used to live there. They are not there anymore. But it's really kind of an address book. And then you have the void in the center. You can see it's a disconnected emptiness. Again, not really a classical museum space with bridges across it. And I want to tell you what my intention here was. Since I was a musician, I wanted to complete an opera, a famous opera, written by Arnold Schoenberg, the great Viennese Berlin composer, who composed a piece of music, an opera, I don't know whether you know it, called Moses and Aaron. It's an amazing opera. He didn't complete it. He completed the 2 acts. Then he was deported from Berlin. He left. He escaped. As a famous musician, he could not be there anymore. He was a Jew. And the opera ends with Moses calling to God. And then there is a silence. And that's the end of Act 2. Act 3 has never been written. It's interrupted. But I thought you could complete, not in a standard musical way, you could complete that opera in the echoes of the footsteps of the visitors across this void. And if you are ever in Berlin and stand there, you will hear kind of the answer that God has given to Moses. It's in the echoes of those footsteps across the contemporary void. And there it is, a museum which has really changed the idea of what Berlin was. It's a fantastic city, a city I love, city that is now full of diversity. And by the way, Kreuzberg, where the building is the large Turkish area of Berlin. And again, prejudice, bigotry, not accepting people as they are is something of a threat that we all face. War. Well, we are really in an era of wars. Wars are ever present in our daily lives. We see them sometimes far away. I had a chance to create a museum in this beautiful city. This is the painting of Dresden. Dresden was considered the Venice of the North, perhaps the most beautiful city in the north of Europe. You can see the magnificence of the city. But you can also probably maybe remember or not this photograph of Dresden after the 1945 bombings, Allied bombings. The complete city was eradicated from the earth. And then I had the assignment to create really museum of war, the Military History Museum, which is the largest museum in Germany, in this U-shaped armory, which was already a museum in 1900. It was a museum later on of Hitler, of the Nazis, museum of the Soviets, museum of the East German Republic, and now after the fall of the wall, it became really, again, the question, how do we display history of war? What do we do? How do we show it? Well, you can see that I created a very dramatic thing. I renovated the armory, but I also created kind of a vector. And this vector is a self-similar vector to the 3 bombs that fell really onto Dresden during that fatal day in 1945, February 13th, 15th. So you're standing in the matrix of this catastrophe. At the same time, this vector is projected outside of the museum where you can see the rebuilt city of Dresden. Now you can see this in the plan, in the cut. The plan is chronological. From the left to right, you have a Teutonic Knights, 12th century German knights, all the way to NATO soldiers in Afghanistan from Germany on the right. The cut is exactly between 1914 and 1945, which is the militaristic years from Germany that brought so much suffering and so much death to the world. You can see that in this section I incorporated all the classical features of this 19th century space and created really a contrast, a kind of a cut through the history that really projects itself to people on the outside of the building. It just shows you that it's not a facade, but the entire building is evacuated, its own structure, through this vector, which really points at what has happened. And here you have the column structure of the armory, historically protected building. I only cut it in 2 places, actually, not in more, just 2 thin lines. And you can see this new space created here in the beginning. Of course, you have toys, exhibitions of things that fall from the skies. By the way, in this vector, you don't have really armaments shown. You don't have the military equipment. What you have is questions given to the public. Now, questions are the following. Why do people follow authoritarian leaders? Why do people agree to march? Why do people agree to shoot when told to do that? Of course, no answers can be given. Nobody can give it, but it is an experience for the visitors to confront questions that are difficult and also obscure in how fates of societies and nations evolve. And then, of course, at the very top of the building, you can leave the wedge. And I think that's really the moment. You're on an upward plane. You have the view of the rebuilt Dresden with Frauenkirche and all the amazing places that you see in the city. But you're suspended in front of the building and in the wind, because it's an open structure. You're in the wind, and I thought that was important, that it's no longer generals sitting behind the walls of armories who decide fate. In a democratic society, it's the citizens who are suspended in the winds of time. And that's really the experience here as you really reach the apogee of the museum and think about what war is. And of course, this is not a museum of peace. This is a museum of military history museum where the German forces, for example, the officers come to learn about their own history. But it's a museum that speaks about what is the catastrophe of militarism, of war, and of what we saw emerging from that society long ago. Okay, on a very different note, home. You know, I'm an architect, but I only recently have had my chance to build my second house. So somebody asked me to build a house, and as I sometimes mention, you know, I lived my life in reverse, because, you know, most people start young, and they become old. I started old, and I became young. You know, because I started in teaching, I started in meditation, I started in kind of luxury of free theory, and then my life changed into really working with my hands and on projects. So home is a project that took me, for the first time, a couple commissioned me to make a house for them. It's in a beautiful site. Here it is. It's not really a box of any sort. It's as compressed as the life of my clients. It stands in Connecticut in a beautiful, you know, about an hour away from New York. It's really a monocoque construction. There's no columns. It's a self-evolving structure, stainless steel here, which really picks up very different colors. It's hard to show it because sometimes it's brown, it's blue, it's green. It depends how you approach the house and at what time. But inside of the house, it's completely solid wood. Really, it's not a wood veneer. It's really solid oak wood. And I was so lucky because my clients, who are also very good cooks, asked me to really design everything. It's a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk in the old sense. You know, the carpets, the bookcase, you know, it's fantastic to be able to, even the shower. Now, it's a company that produces showers and equipment, so it might be interesting. But, you know, I never liked the English idea, the Victorian idea of showers with those soft things. Showers should be something really exciting. And, and even the faucet is kind of a reinvention, because I don't like those faucets, those silver faucets, but just a straight line, straight geometric line, which is cut when you open it, and cut and then closes into, again, a straight line. So I had a lot of fun to create really intimacy for my clients, to create a sense of beauty, a sense of a place that they love. And I always say I only made one mistake in this house, a single mistake, because our clients gave us, Nina and myself, a key one weekend. They said, you can stay in the house for a weekend. And then my wife said to me, why don't we have a house like this? Okay, city. Cities, you know, are fantastic. And being in Istanbul, by the way, it's one of the most fantastic cities. I've been here several times. You're lucky to live in a city that has such multiple cultures and such richness of life today, yesterday, and tomorrow. It's fantastic. So when I was building in Singapore, I thought, what can I do on this sliver of land in this city-state? Now, you notice that these towers are not really extruded towers. They are doubly curved towers. And I thought that it was important for each person in this tower to have a different position of space. Now, you know it's not so easy to do this. The developers have said, well, Mr. Libeskind, that's a little bit too much. We don't need double curve. Just one curve is enough. It's too expensive. So, of course, being an architect who wants to make the job, I had to eliminate one of the curves. Then we went to the agency, the planning agency of Singapore, were very progressive. And they looked at it and they said to the developers, well, we saw these doubly curved towers. They were beautiful. If you want to have only one curve, we'll reduce the height back by 50%, which is what it was. Well, then the developer said, no, we'll do it. We'll do that. So you can see, even in this plan, the buildings, each one is unique. Each one has its own view. And it's really a very tight site to create something that is sustainable, something that really works. The bridges contain the amenities of the buildings. And by the way, Ridley Scott, the filmmaker, just made a film there about the future, but the project is already some years old. So there it is, public spaces of the promenade, cafes, recreation, and a sense of community, which is very important. And of course, by building so much higher than the allowable ratio in terms of height, we were able to really leave much more of the space green, open, and I think that's key. How do we create a sustainable city? How do we not spread the buildings, infinitely and consume the energy, but create cities that are more responsive in terms of the carbon emissions and their place in the world? So that's really kind of a city that has its own beauty. It's developing very quickly, and then I was able to build on a site not far from it, another project, very different planning regulations, but you'll notice what I did here is I put the lowest buildings where they have the best views rather than the tallest buildings, so that every person in this project, where the buildings emerge from the water, has a view. Every unit has a view, every apartment has a view of this beautiful bay of Kappel, and you can see reflections in the distance. Again, something that is a community, a sense of space, and a sense of iconic architecture for residential. We expect iconic architecture for museums, for public buildings, but I believe that people's lives, 24 hours a day, need to have also architecture that is memorable, iconic, and important. Experience. Well, I also live in Milan, and in Milan, as you know, it's a fantastic city. It's a city that goes back in time. It goes through so many eras of architecture, probably has the most beautiful Duomo in Italy. By the way, a competition for the Duomo was an international competition back in 15th century, 16th century. Leonardo da Vinci participated in the competition, but he lost. That's amazing. Yeah, the world is fantastic. Okay, so here I was working on this site, which is Fiera di Milano, really in the center of the city, the fairgrounds. And the fairgrounds were there from the already from 1910 till today, and they moved outside to the suburbs. And this 64-acre site became available. And believe me, every architect that was in this competition. Renzo Piano, Frank Gehry, Richard Meyer, Chipperfield, you can name it. Every architect won. Now, I had a very different idea. I entered with two friends, with Zaha Hadid and Arata Isozaki, and I did the master plan. Now, my master plan was to create three unique towers in the center of the site, and at the same time, really treat the site as a park where you can build residential, retail, and all the facilities, create really a new sense, not following the grid of that square that you saw, but create really a major new green space in this really beautiful city that has so much hardscape. And I'm glad that we did win the competition. I did win the master plan. You can see here the three towers. The central one is mine. You see the park, and of course, a lot of it is about residential space, which has new character, residential space with new smart buildings, intelligent technology, sustainable buildings with good materials that provide very different sense of place in this great city. I also created really a kind of a traditional courtyard that Milanese, that's where kids play, that's where mothers look, even though the buildings are high. And I used the terraces, which are really very large. You can have dinners and you can sleep on the terraces. The weather in Milan is pretty good. Probably 60% of the time you can use the outdoor space and shape the buildings, which are really very practical, pragmatic, extruded buildings with really shapes that bring light and life to the external parts of the building. So you can see it here, very, very large project. We're still working on a second part. My tower now in conversation with the 2 towers that have been built. It's Price Waterhouse is the owner of the tower. And you can see it's part of the idea to create that kind of dome-like three-dimensional space. And I think what's unprecedented, there are 3 buildings, one by Isozaki, one by Zaha, by myself, which really have each one has its own unique geometry, and we made them relate to each other in very interesting architectural ways. I don't know any other city that has 3 completely different towers that are interrelated architecturally and spatially. So that's really, in a short time, it definitely was a controversial project. You can imagine, in this old ancient city, people were, oh my God, how can you do this? This will be terrible for the city. But after a while, of course, the controversy sort of fizzles out and people realize a great place to live. And this project is now, there are at least 3 or 4 major projects in Milan that have a new height, they have a new sense of space. And I always think about this, that cities cannot just rely on their history. They cannot just rely on the beauty of their past. They have to do something for the future to compete. And so Milan is a very competitive city, together with, like London, like Berlin, like other cities, a city that moves forward. It's a little bit like banking. If you keep taking money out of the bank, there's not going to be anything left. You have to put some money into the bank in order to have something. And that's true for our architectural heritage as well. Gateway. Well, I'm lucky to have worked in Denver, middle of the United States. It's really an amazing place in the Rocky Mountains. And I created what I call 2 lines going for a walk. It's really a building based on really 2 geometries. The geometry of the downtown Denver, which is very beautiful, crystalline, and the geometry of the Rocky Mountains, which you see. And you can see the building. It's a building that cuts diagonally across, connecting itself to another famous building, and creates a completely new sense of what the city is in its center. Now, I was able to create a public space. This was, downtown of American City. It was dark at night, parking, cars parked, nothing happening. So I suggested to create a piazza in the center and to create housing on the other side and frame the building with public space, which has art. I did that because those housing blocks that you see, which I designed, are hiding actually a large garage, which has 5 stories of parking, thousands of cars. Now I have to tell you, I was in this competition with great architects whose names you will know definitely. And all the famous architects said, we don't have a problem. Let's put the car parking down, below the ground, and then we have a nice space. But if you care about the budget, you realize if you put the cars on the ground, it's very expensive. There's no money for the building. So I created a very, very standard garage for thousands of cars. But then with the housing, I proposed, and of course, this housing uses the terrace of the garage, the upper level, as a fantastic park. So again, addition to a city, the museum is really hard to show. It's not a museum of old art. It's a museum of contemporary art. In fact, the museum director today told me that he does not want to have any artists who are more than 40 years old. He said, I don't want any artists who are more than 40 years old. That's old art. I want contemporary art, which of course is not just painting. It's installations, it's artists working directly into the building, using the building as their palette. And of course, there are public spaces in the building that are also activating the building as a social space. It's not only for art, it's for parties, it's for celebrations, it's really for citizens of Denver. And it is very, very dramatic buildings, clad in titanium. The titanium company is actually in Denver and donated the titanium. Little did I know that titanium is much more expensive to actually put onto the building. So that was really a struggle. But I have to tell you, Mr. Hamilton, whose name is on the building, who was a man of oil companies and so on, said to me in the beginning, Mr. Libeskind, I'd like a building from marble with classical columns and a pediment. So I thought, wow, that's going to be a difficult one. But the truth is that Mr. Hamilton, who passed away recently, as the project developed, began to like it. And at the end, he said, I love it. It's not what I expected. I expected something like a temple from ancient times, but it's a new temple. It's something that I like. And of course, what is great is that Denver now is one of the biggest hubs for art in America. It has about 1 million people a year coming. When I started, it was considered a cow town. Town in the middle of nowhere. With a lot of grass and skiers. But now it's really a hub of art. And in fact, the last 2 shows, Christian Dior did not go to New York to the Museum of Modern Art, did not go to Chicago, did not go to LA. They selected really Denver because of the spaces, the variety of spaces that the building provided for exhibitions. Climate. Well, that's really a key in our life. Climate. How do we control climate, knowing that we live in an era where people have changed nature itself? We, by what we do, have changed how nature is developing. So what do you do in a beautiful French city? So this is a city of Toulouse, the pink city near the Pyrenees, very classical, very low. And you see that dot. That was my first really drawing. I thought, people expect a short, fat, large building. Let's not do a short, fat, large building. Let's create a tower. Not to be ashamed of height, because, Toulouse is the center of Airbus. It's modern industry. Modern technology is in Toulouse. So I thought, let's create something really fantastic on this railway. And here you see, it's a very unusual tower because the greenery that you see is a park. It's not two-dimensional. It's not some green grown on the tower. It's deep. If you were to unfold it, it's thousands of square meters of a park that reaches this very interesting building which has residential, it has hotels, has retail, has public spaces, and so on. You can see it next to the railway station. You're only about 2.5 hours from Paris by the fast train. So again, an ancient city, a city that needs to also develop itself. And by the way, it's not easy to build this project. I had to present it in Paris to 40 of the top experts of history of France. Some of whom thought, oh my God, if this is built, maybe France will be destroyed. But it's not true. They, at the end, voted, yes, it's a good idea to introduce new architecture into our country, and it's a good idea to create something that has a new sense of the place in which it is. And of course, it is right next to the Canal du Midi, under UNESCO heritage. It's a tower that I think will really redefine the possibilities. And of course, there are many low buildings, but my suggestion is that this railway tracks should really have taller buildings, sustainable buildings that create a new core, which of course will happen in time. What is interesting is I proposed to my developers that the building should not just be private, that at the very top of the building, the park, should end in public spaces for citizens of Toulouse, of anyone can come. It's not just a restaurant, it's actually public community space. And I think that's good that it's not just private investment, not just for people who are lucky to live in these buildings, but it's available to people. And by the way, I don't only work on these luxurious projects. I just won several competitions in New York for public housing, very low-cost public housing in Bedford-Stuyvesant, housing for the elderly in Long Island, low-cost housing in Detroit. Because it's not about money. It's not about how much money one has. It's about the idea of dignity and giving people a sense of community in an urban environment. Now, I'm also lucky to work in this beautiful city. Probably one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Well, every city is beautiful, but Nice is kind of known in France with, again, a program that is very, multiple, which has, shops, it has hotels, it has residential, it has offices, it has public facilities and cultural facilities. So it is next to the central railway station of Nice, built in the 19th century, very beautiful. Right on the railway line, you can see it right here. It's a project that breaks the scale of this large city block and creates really a sculptural form that is dramatic. It's blue, and it's blue because not just the Côte d'Azur, but you see the sky, you see the mountains, sometimes covered with snow, you see the sea, the Mediterranean, and it's a project that really connects you across, you see the highways built in the 60s, and the railways that cut the city in half to really create a momentum to cross the divide and create a project that is really interesting, that is profitable, of course, that is interesting from all the views, from the highway, from the train, from the streets, and something that will really add to the beauty and the vibrancy of Nice. And by the way, there were 6 other projects in the competition. All of them had arches, of different kinds, neoclassic, romantic, 19th century. But I was so glad that the authorities, people in the jury said, no, we've had enough of imitation history, enough of nostalgia. We need something that is, based on the human scale, the scale of the city, the scale of France, but something that gives us also a sense of the future. Rebirth. Well, that's probably the most difficult project anybody could have possibly worked in. It's ground zero in New York, 9/11. And we know that that day, really, the world changed. Everything in the world changed in that second, in that minute. And everyone really knows where he or she was on the date. We all remember. And I'm often asked, where was I on 9/11? Well, I was not in New York. I was in Berlin. After 13 years of working on the Jewish Museum in Berlin, the museum was to open to the public on 9/11, 2001. And of course, by 2:30 or so in the afternoon, Berlin time, we saw the attacks on Washington, on New York, Pennsylvania. We saw the deaths, and the museum never opened. And how interesting is it that history is never just over. There's always something unexpected, something that is connected to the past that's unexpected, and that's creating kind of a future that is sometimes unknown, obscure. At that moment in Berlin, I turned to Nina, I turned to my colleagues, and I said, I'm going back to New York, because my work was finished. The museum opened about a week later, and how strange that I really won the competition. This was the largest competition in the world. There were 5,000 architects, 5,000. And some of those architects were groups of maybe 100 or 200 experts in traffic, economics, structure, history. So the teams are vast. Well, we entered just with a very small team, very few people. My idea was a very simple one, not to build where deaths took place, to leave the center of the site where the building stood, really a public memorial, a public space. Now you have to remember that New York City did not declare this site as sacred ground. This is a commercial site. Every square centimeter of New York City is very expensive. So it's really pretty radical to say, don't build on half of the site, 8 acres. Don't build on it. Put the buildings far away, but save this for the public space. Now, just to describe to you a little bit who is the client of this project, because it's not one client. Of course, there's money of America, federal government money for the infrastructure. There is the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which has 7,000 engineers. Think about it. Organization with 7,000 engineers and architects. Port Authority leases the land at ground zero to private developers and their own architects. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey is run by 2 powerful governors, the governor of New York and the governor of New Jersey. The streets of New York are not controlled by the Port Authority or by the governors. They're controlled by the mayor of New York because they belongs to the city of New York. What is underground does not belong to New York. It belongs to the path train authorities and the subway authorities. So you can see that it is really a vast array of interests. And my idea was that in a democracy, you have to bring people together in order to have a common goal. Because, of course, people thought very differently about what to do on this site. And that, indeed, is my first drawing. You see that it's related to the Torch of Liberty. There is a tower, 1776 feet tall, which is dedicated to the date of the Declaration of Independence. There is all the way down to the bedrock, a museum, and, of course, the sense of memory and the future. Now, I show this not out of vanity, but out of the fact that such a project is a project where every single person around the world has a stake in it. It's not just a project you can do somehow in your studio, do some drawings, and go away. You're under scrutiny 24 hours a day, every day of your life. And people said to me, Mr. Libeskind, don't you think you would be lucky if you were in China? Because then they will build this in 2 minutes, 2 years, and it will be perfect. There will be no discussion. It will be glowing, beautiful. No, no. It's better to work in a democracy, really. As difficult as democracy is, it's really the only system, I think, that is worth really working in because it's real. And the stakeholders, as I said, and all the different complexities make the project very, very real. So here's a sketch, early sketch, and you can see the towers, you can see the park, the footprints, visitor center. You can even see the in the distance the Performing Arts Center, which is under construction. So really, it's not completed because Tower 2 is not yet built. There are some things missing, but I've worked on it for 15, 16 years. It's maybe 85% finished. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. And for architecture, you really need to be very patient. By the way, most master plans, as you know, never get built. After 5 years, all the conditions have changed. Money has changed. Economics have changed. Politics have changed. After 5 years, you hang the master plan in a museum as something which has never been built. But I had a different idea. I said, it's possible to divide the site into parcels, discrete parcels. You can build the foundations for each one. And when the economy allows a building to be built, when money comes, you can really build something there. And that's indeed what has happened. Of course, my competitors, those who really were in the running, proposed large-scale megastructures, mega towers and so on in the center of the site. Little did they know that nobody had intent or money economically to build such fantasies. So again, architecture has to be very practical in order to be successful and build. I also really exposed this wall, which is underground, and I have to tell you a little anecdote. When I came to the site, I was in the One Liberty Plaza, a big skyscraper right next to the site with all the 7 finalists. And somebody from the Port Authority said, do you want to go down to the site? And everybody said, no, it's much better, much easier to see the site from the top, from the window, here looking down. But Nina and I wanted to see the site. And really, I have to say, as you walk down that ramp, 75 feet down below the streets of New York, your life changes. You understand something you could not possibly understand from the drawings, from the studying of the site. You understand the spiritual sense of the site. And I touched this wall kind of by accident. I didn't know what it was. And the engineer who was with me said, that's the slurry wall. And I wasn't even sure what a slurry wall was. But it's a huge dam. On the left side, you have the pressure of the Hudson River. You have the pressure of water. So if this wall had fallen, all the subways, all the underground of New York would have been flooded. It would have really been apocalyptic. So I thought this wall, the resilience of the wall, the fact that this wall was built by people in construction is a testament to solidarity, to what people can do when they work together in a democratic society. And by the way, when the Pope Francis came to New York and made his speech to all religions, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Zen, and so on, he chose the slurry wall to deliver his message of peace to the world and solidarity of human beings. I thought it was fantastic because he didn't choose Central Park. He didn't choose Times Square. He chose that wall, which means that really walls do speak. Architecture is a language, and the walls, the windows, the light speaks to us across boundaries, across nations, across divisions, across religions, across languages. That's the beauty of architecture. And so here it is. The waterfalls, the names are carved really around of the almost 3,000 people who perished. And by the way, I had the idea of the waterfalls in the competition, which was highly criticized by the newspapers. They thought it was crazy. Libeskind brings Niagara Falls into downtown New York. Insane. But it's not insane because it's water. It's the water of life. You can see it going down. You can see it flowing. And it also is an acoustical device which screens the very loud, noisy city all around to give a sense of intimacy to any individual who comes there. And so many individuals come there, almost 30 million every year. It's not a finished site. But more important, almost 500,000 people have moved to Lower Manhattan around the site. This was an area that people said nobody will ever live again after these attacks. It's a catastrophe. No one will return to Manhattan. It's true. That was the thought at that time. But I'm so glad that people have moved back. It's it's really the center of New York for the next generation. And you can see that it has new vistas, a new sense of space. And I created an additional device, which is not yet visible completely, which is the wedge of light, which is really a memorial in the light of New York between 8:46 a.m. when the first tower was hit and 10:28 in the morning when the second tower collapsed. It's a memorial that is defined, you can see, by the central oculus of the path terminal and the edge, southern edge of tower number 2, which is not yet built. But when it's built, you'll get a sense of the day. Even on a cloudy day, you'll see it. There it is, the oculus, which opens on September 11th. Here it is, the vibrance of New York, and of course, the Statue of Liberty. And I have to tell you the honest thing that I thought about my parents. My parents are no longer alive, but they were workers in factories. They had hard lives. My mother works in the sweatshops of New York. My father was a printer. And so they worked in factories, hard lives. And I thought, what do people like that get from this? They will never be in the beautiful buildings. They will never work for Condé Nast or Time Magazine or any of those companies. Where will they be? They will be in the subways. They will be in the trains. They will be on the streets. What do they get? That's what I thought. They should get vistas of hope, vistas of the beauty of New York, good transportation, which is part of the project underground, and a sense that memory and history and the future really flow together. Okay, now future. That's really a very lucky project I'm working on with this man on Time Magazine. This is Richard Leakey. Richard Leakey and his family virtually himself invented the art of anthropology, the science of anthropology. He's the first person to really discover that we are linked together. We all come together from somewhere. We are not just created ex nihilo. We do have a history. And he's worked a lot on this issue, how man became man, how woman became woman, how a child became a child. So Richard Leakey is an amazing scientist. He's a visionary. He is an inspired person. And I'm working with him and a group of scientists from Oxford University on a museum here in the Rift Valley, where we all come from Africa. Africa is where we all come from, our DNA. We started walking from Africa, reaching different parts of the world. And I was inspired when I saw the Turkana Tools, the earliest tools. How amazing that someone, somewhere, some genius, looked at a piece of stone and had another stone in his hand and realized that if you hit the stone in a certain way, you can get a sharp point. A sharp point was needed in order to cut through, to be able to live, to survive. That's the first tools. If you think about this, you think of genetics, you think of space travel, you think of everything that we have. This is the beginning of it. This is the beginning of human creativity, to create from such a thing, like a stone, a future. So there is the building. It's really inspired by sort of the stone axe that is sort of slivered off, slipped off, and it creates really a very dramatic vistas in this Rift Valley where you really see the history of where we come from. It's called Ngaren in Swahili, which is origins. So a very dramatic space. It's not really just a space of museology. It's really a space, a kind of space for pilgrimage, a space to come to. And it has very, very modern exhibits, electronic exhibits, virtual reality, and so on. So it's a space that I think will show the importance of Kenya, show the importance of Nairobi, the center of Africa, in terms of culture and what links us together. And here it is, solitary, standing in this amazing space that really connects really Middle East, goes all the way to Turkey, goes all the way back across Mediterranean to Europe, to Australia, to America. There it is. And I end here with a little film of Richard Leakey about this project.
I began to look for fossils at Lake Turkana 50 years ago, just over 50 years ago. But over the last 50 years, we have collected sufficient number of fossils to demonstrate a remarkable story about how humanity came to be what it is today. And I want to portray from the beginning, after the Big Bang, What happened to this block of rock that got flung into space and developed ultimately atmospheres, water, and how out of that life began. The story now is so complete, and yet it's never been told in a celebratory way. If we can get across the message that we're all one species, we all have a common ancestor, we certainly all have a common destiny, then the issue of bigotry, colour, racism, just simply pales into insignificance against the real story of what we have to do to survive. The last big extinction, which happened as a result of an asteroid colliding with the Earth somewhere near the Gulf of Mexico, and the drastic change in climate killed off many species that simply couldn't adapt quick enough to survive. What's frightening is that we are behaving like an asteroid. We're in direct collision with the systems of life, polluting the ocean, overpopulating the planet, knocking out species that are fundamental to our own survival. And yet we have the technology, I believe we have the brains. If we bring together the two and we realize that the damage to the planet today is not an asteroid but is us, we can change the way we do things. I think a wow experience on the human story is what we need. And so I visualize an architectural design that would match the Sydney Opera House. We're going to build in Garran, on the edge of the Rift Valley. The paleontological record in the sites in the Rift Valley is phenomenal. And I think there's something very symbolic about telling the story where the story unfolded. Imagine going into a gallery and you have people seated and your guide says, please be quiet because I'm going to introduce you to some of your ancestors. And then quite suddenly, a Zinjanthropus racing into the room and then stops and looks back with a look of horror and fear. And suddenly from another side of the room come in a band of Homo habilis wielding a club. And you hear screams and yells. The story comes alive. You're there, you're in it. They can actually walk behind you and you're terrified. We want people to get the experience. Yes, I saw it. That's what you want. There's nothing like it in the world. The building that Daniel Libeskind has designed is based on the shape and form of a primitive stone axe, a hand axe. It'll stand 80 meters tall, a place where your first reaction is, wow. We're a species that now has the capacity to understand through science, to respond through technology. We have to understand the concept of cause and effect. The future of life on planet Earth will depend on how we treat the planet.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. I think I can take a few questions. Maybe I don't understand Turkish very well, but I think I have a translation here. Okay. Okay. Okay.
This will be in English. This will be in English.
Okay.
The question will be in English.
Oh, excellent.
Okay. Hello again. This will be a bit selfish question.
Okay.
I will ask it as an architectural historian and as a student of Dalibor Vesely, a common friend, I suppose, who recently passed away. I wonder if you ever thought of how you straight yourself. Do you have a self-image, self-idea, self-reflection of yourself in architectural history? And what's your relation to the modern project, modernism? And did you ever think of how to define yourself in theoretical and historical terms? Yourself and your architecture, yeah.
That's a very difficult question to answer. That would imply that you have to think about yourself. I really don't think too much about myself. The truth is that I don't like any ism. You know, modernism, like any futurism or historicism, is kind of an ideology that doesn't appeal to me. I try to do work which is really in our time, work that deals with contemporary questions, and work that really represents something that I truly believe in. And it's not really private, because to achieve any of these projects, you need large-scale support. Not just from one, billionaire, but you need really citizens to answer and to require that work to be there. So the architecture is really, if you think about it, a very political field. Political not because there are politicians involved, but the politeia, the citizens, really are your client. Whether you're in Denver, whether you're in Africa, whether you're in South America, we're building a museum of anthropology in Chile, whether you are in Berlin, wherever, really it's a public art. And I often think about it, that if you're an artist or a philosopher or a musician, a filmmaker, you can do whatever you want. But as an architect, you cannot, because you're responsible to the civic society. Now, Jacques Derrida, the famous philosopher, who was also a friend of mine, once told me that he could publish any text he wants because he can find a publisher in France, some small publisher to publish his book, or if not, he can put it on the internet and people can read it and make their own judgment of it. But he said to me, oh, you, Mr. Libeskind, you need a legal document to build even a small building. And it's true. If you think about it, even to make a small addition, you need a legal document, which is signed by lawyers, by politicians. It's a very, very strange art. Really, it is. Because it's partly an art, but partly a response to a community. So how do I think of myself? I think of myself as a traditional architect.
Okay. Would you be happy to be called, in a sense, expressionist?
Well, I always say people are very allergic to the idea of expression in architecture, correct? You know, you can express yourself in singing. You can express yourself by ordering an espresso cup of coffee because it's not watered down. It's really the essence of coffee. But the idea of expression in architecture seems to be illegal. And why? Because we've gotten into the myth that what is neutral is really what we want. But really, in true life, neutrality is not a noble achievement. Neutrality is standing aside, but taking a very strong position by standing aside. So I've never believed that the architecture of the Renaissance, the architecture here in Istanbul, the architecture that I admire around the world, has never been neutral. It has taken a position towards divinity, towards sacred, towards the public, towards nature, towards the mountains, the earth. And in that sense, really, I think architecture is changing. I think this notion of modernism, that you should reduce all architecture to some sort of abstraction, is failing. And I think architecture is once again becoming part of a storytelling. Now, when you go to these great buildings here in the city or elsewhere, the buildings do tell you a story. Even if you're not educated, you get the story. You get the sense of the light. And I think that's the beauty of architecture. Thank you.
Hello.
Well, hi.
So everybody say the best response to criticism is success, but I really want to know what is your personal response to negative criticism? Like, I saw some articles that say, for example, the Ontario Toronto Museum is the ugliest building in the town. So, like, for such criticism, how do you personally react? Thank you.
Well, you know, everybody has a right to their opinion. For sure.
Turkish. Teşekkür ediyorum öncelikle sunumunuz için. Teşekkür ediyorum sunumunuz için. Şunu belirtmek istiyorum. Mimar değilim. İnşaat mühendisiyim. Yapısal tasarım mühendisiyim. Şunu merak ediyorum özel olarak. Çok zorlu, sivri köşeli, yüksek ve geçilmesi oldukça zor çözümlemeleriniz var. Mühendisleriniz size bir sistemde bulunuyor mu? Yani ya da bir zorlanmadan bahsediyorlar. Bunu gerçekten merak ediyorum. Teşekkür ediyorum tekrardan.
Well, it's a great question. You know, I'm lucky to work with some of the world's great engineers. And you know, there used to be a divide. There used to be the architect on one side and then the engineer on the other side. And they're usually two different fields. But today, because of our technology, because of what we already know scientifically, architecture and engineering are very closely combined. You cannot build any of these buildings without a very close connection organically to engineering. So you cannot just make a design and then say, let's get an engineer to make it stand up. On the contrary, you have to work from the very beginning with ideas of structure, with ideas of materials, with ideas of engineering. And I think that's kind of beautiful because, in truth, architecture really wants to make things go away into far cosmic spaces. But engineers want to pull it down, usually to the ground, make sure that it doesn't evaporate. And the truth is that this division, and I've worked, you know, Cecil Beaumont in London, with many great engineers across the world, the fields have really changed. And we don't have this division any longer. And I think, I would say a lot of engineers really are architects, and a lot of architects have engineering genius in their work too. So yes, there is no such line.
Hello. As an architecture student, I would like to ask you about something I normally face in my designs. In your projects, how do you find a balance between having a contrast to the area or having a harmonious design with the area? Because sometimes we're asked to do both of them, and it's a bit hard to understand the surroundings and whether if you want to have a contrast with them or harmony. So how do you balance these two concepts, let's say?
About harmony and context and buildings, is that the question?
The contrast to the area, like whether we want to have a contrast with the surroundings or have a harmony with the surroundings. How do you balance them?
Well, you wouldn't have harmony if you didn't have contrast. I mean, that's the essence of harmony. You know, that's the essence of counterpoint in music, that it requires a difference, it requires a counterpoint in order to have a harmony. So yes, I would say the least harmonic buildings are the buildings that are monodic, that are really monotone buildings. We have a lot of them, but harmony requires a difference. And of course, each site is unique. Each site has to be analyzed and experienced in a unique way. And the response also, I think, has to be unique because the context is not really dead. Some people think that context is given and it's eternal and it's just there. But think about it, every second the world is changing. Every second the grass is changing. Every second the molecules in the earth are changing. So there's nothing really inert. Life is dynamic. Life is living. That's the difference between living and not living. And I think to understand the context that is alive is to understand the city. And the city is a living organism. It's not something just because it's made out of stone that is inert. So that's why the architecture of historical cities has also changed. Look at the fire in Notre Dame. I was just there the day before the fire sketching the cathedral. I had a couple of hours and I went to sketch it. And then we realized that this illusion that we have that these old buildings are just back in time is not true, because they're still living. And of course the wood and the lead and all the materials that caught on fire were never really protected by contemporary accelerated technology. We should have taken care of it. It belongs to the French nation. It belongs to humanity. It should have not just been standing there, a building to be exploited but by millions of tourists around the world and neglected. So yes, I think that's important for heritage, that the heritage is alive. All these great old buildings are not old. They are really new buildings as well. And all I can say is we have to take care of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.